I'm Brooke Winters, 32, and I never thought I'd be the one to bring my father to justice. The man who taught me to ride a bike was trying to steal everything my mother left behind. In that crowded courtroom with his perfect act crumbling, I whispered just 2 words that made the judge turn pale. 2 words that changed everything. The look on my father's face, from arrogant to terrified in seconds, is something I'll never forget. Before I tell you what those 2 words were, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if you want more stories about standing up to toxic family members. Growing up, I believed I had a picture-perfect family. My mother, Rebecca, was a force of nature, brilliant kind and fiercely protective. She built her real estate development company from nothing into one of the most respected firms in our state. My father, James, was charming and well-liked by everyone. He coached Little League, remembered everyone's birthdays, and always had the perfect joke for any occasion. At neighborhood barbecues, people would comment on how lucky I was to have such loving parents. But inside our home, things were more complicated. My father never physically abused us, but there was always this undercurrent of control. He had to approve every decision my mother made, even though she was the one supporting our family financially. I remember being 16 and overhearing them arguing in the kitchen about a new property development she wanted to pursue. "You really think you can handle something that size?" Dad's voice had that particular tone, the one that sounded concerned to anyone else, but was actually dripping with doubt. Mom responded, "James, I've run the numbers. This could double our portfolio within 3 years. And what about our family? What about Brooke? You'll be so busy you'll forget you even have a daughter." That was his go-to move, using me as leverage. The irony was that my mother never missed a single one of my events despite her busy career. Dad, on the other hand, would sometimes be too tired from a day of what I later realized was very little actual work at his sporadic consulting job. The older I got, the more I recognized the pattern. Dad resented that Mom was the breadwinner. He'd make subtle digs about her masculine job or suggest that her clients only hired her because she was attractive. When she won awards, he'd joke about being Mr. Rebecca Winters as if her success somehow diminished him. Still, they stayed together, and I convinced myself that despite the tension, they loved each other. That belief held until my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer when I was 29. The prognosis was grim from the beginning, but my mother faced it with the same determination she'd approached everything in life. During her 18 months of treatment, I moved back home to help care for her. Dad's response to her illness was strange. He seemed more inconvenienced than devastated. While I took Mom to chemo appointments and held her hair back when she was sick, Dad was often busy or working. I noticed he'd started taking more business trips, sometimes disappearing for days with vague explanations. One afternoon, when Mom was feeling stronger, she asked me to drive her to her lawyer's office. "I'm updating my will," she explained, her voice matter of fact, despite how thin she'd become. "There are things that need to be protected." I didn't ask questions. It felt too much like acknowledging she was dying. But on the drive back, she reached for my hand. "Brooke, promise me something," she said. "Whatever happens, protect what's yours. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve it." At the time, I thought she was giving me general life advice. I had no idea she was warning me about Dad. As Mom got sicker, Dad grew more distant. He'd come home late smelling like expensive cologne that wasn't his usual brand. His phone would ding with texts he'd quickly hide. I was too focused on Mom to investigate, but looking back, all the signs were there. A week before she died, Mom had a moment of startling clarity after days of being medicated for pain. "I've set things up for you," she told me, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "The house, the business shares. They're for you. You've earned them, sweetheart." I tried to shush her to tell her we'd have time to discuss this later, but she insisted. "Your father, he's not the man I thought I married. Promise me you'll stand your ground." She died peacefully 3 days later. At her funeral, Dad played the devastated widower perfectly. He accepted condolences with moist eyes and heartfelt handshakes. But I noticed he seemed more concerned with who attended than with actually mourning Mom. He spent more time networking with Mom's business associates than reflecting on her life. When I found him exchanging numbers with one of Mom's investors near the refreshment table, something cold settled in my stomach. That night, after everyone had gone, I stood in Mom's closet, breathing in her fading scent from her clothes. I noticed her jewelry box was open and several pieces were missing. pieces I knew she wore regularly. When I mentioned it to Dad, he shrugged. Probably the cleaning lady, he said, not meeting my eyes. Don't worry about it. But I was beginning to worry about a lot of things. 2 weeks after we scattered my mother's ashes in her favorite garden, my father's demeanor shifted dramatically. Gone was the grieving widower, replaced by a man suddenly interested in getting affairs in order. He stopped asking how I was doing with my grief. Instead, his questions centered around Mom's business documents, her home office, and whether she'd mentioned anything about financial arrangements before she died. One morning, I came downstairs to find him in Mom's office, rifling through her filing cabinet. Just organizing, he said casually, though he quickly closed the drawer when I entered. By the way, I handled that will situation. You don't need to worry about any of that complicated legal stuff. My chest tightened. What will situation? Oh, you know the estate. It's all very technical. He waved his hand dismissively. The lawyer explained that since we had joint assets, everything transfers to me naturally. I'll make sure you get something, of course. Something felt wrong. Mom had specifically mentioned updating her will, making provisions for me. I contacted her personal lawyer, Stephanie Torres, who confirmed my suspicions. Mom had indeed updated her will 6 months before her death. She'd left me the family home, her controlling shares in the business, and the majority of her personal assets. Dad received her retirement accounts and a generous life insurance policy. Hardly nothing. But clearly, not everything. When I confronted him, his reaction sent chills down my spine. Your mother wasn't thinking clearly, he said, his voice softening to a condescending tone. The cancer, the medications, they affected her judgment. She wouldn't have wanted to burden you with all this responsibility. It's not a burden, I countered. And Mom was perfectly lucid when she made these changes. His expression hardened momentarily before he switched tactics. Think about what this looks like, Brooke. A dying woman suddenly cutting her husband out of the will. People will think you manipulated her. Is that what you want? For everyone to see you as the money-hungry daughter who took advantage of her sick mother? The accusation stung exactly as he'd intended. For a moment, I second-guessed myself. Was I being greedy? But then I remembered Mom's words, protect what's yours. Over the next few weeks, Dad alternated between guilt-tripping and acting, concerned about my ability to handle the inheritance. He'd leave brochures for financial advisors, his friends I noticed on the kitchen counter. He brought papers for me to sign that would simplify things. Papers I later learned would have transferred Mom's business shares to him. When subtle manipulation didn't work, Dad grew more direct. You know nothing about running a business, he snapped after I declined to sign yet another document. Your mother built that company for our retirement. You think she wanted it to collapse in your inexperienced hands? You're being selfish, Brooke. Confused and increasingly anxious, I consulted my own lawyer, Rachel Henderson. Her review of the documents my father wanted me to sign confirmed my worst fears. He's trying to get you to sign away your inheritance, Rachel said bluntly. And there's more. He's filed a legal challenge to your mother's will, claiming she was mentally incompetent when she made the changes. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. That's a lie. Mom knew exactly what she was doing. I believe you, Rachel said. But we'll need to prove it in court. Dr. Harrison, Mom's primary oncologist, was outraged when I told him about Dad's claims. Your mother was mentally sound until her final days, he insisted, reviewing his notes. I evaluated her cognitive function regularly. There was no impairment when she updated her will. I'd be happy to testify to that. While I gathered evidence to defend Mom's will, Dad launched a smear campaign against me. Family friends began treating me differently. I received cold shoulders at the grocery store. One of Mom's oldest friends, Barbara, pulled me aside at a community event. Your father says you're trying to take everything, she whispered. That you abandoned your mother during her treatments and now want to cash in. I know that doesn't sound like you, Brooke. I was stunned. I had literally moved home to care for Mom while Dad was nowhere to be found. The lies were so outrageous I couldn't believe anyone would fall for them. But my father had always been charming and convincing. People wanted to believe him. My only ally was Mom's sister, Aunt Lisa. She arrived from Arizona after hearing about the will dispute. Your father is showing his true colors, she said over coffee in my kitchen. Rebecca always knew he married her for her potential. Did you know he was nearly bankrupt when they met? She paid off his gambling debts. He promised to change, and I think he did try for a while. But men like James don't really change. Gambling debts, this was news to me. Dad gambles. Aunt Lisa nodded grimly. Your mother found out he'd started again about 3 years ago. She was trying to figure out how to protect the assets she'd built before confronting him. Then she got sick. The pieces were starting to fit together. The business trips. The missing money from joint accounts Mom had mentioned but never pursued. The strange phone calls. When I returned to the house after meeting with Rachel again, Dad was waiting. The mask of concerned father had completely dropped. "You've made a serious mistake," he said, blocking my path to the stairs. "I'm giving you one chance to drop this nonsense and sign the transfer paperwork. Otherwise, you'll regret crossing me." Looking into his cold eyes, I finally saw what Mom must have realized in her final months. The man I called father was a stranger. Dad's threat wasn't empty. Within days, he escalated from manipulation to outright intimidation. He started showing up at my workplace, loitering in the parking lot until my concerned coworkers walked me to my car. My boss pulled me aside after Dad tried to enter our secure office area. "Is everything okay at home, Brooke? Your father seems unstable." I wanted to explain but couldn't find the words to describe how the man who had raised me had transformed into this threatening stranger. Meanwhile, Dad's smear campaign intensified. He told our family friends that I had abandoned my mother during her final weeks, a cruel inversion of the truth. Mutual acquaintances stopped returning my calls. I was disinvited from the neighborhood book club I'd belonged to for years because my presence would cause tension. The isolation might have broken me if not for the unexpected evidence that surfaced. My childhood friend Madison bumped into Dad at an upscale restaurant downtown. He wasn't alone. A woman named Jessica sat across from him, looking very comfortable with her hand on his arm. She couldn't have been more than 20 years, his junior and only a few years younger than me. They were definitely not discussing business, Madison reported, showing me a discreet photo she'd taken. "I'm sorry, Brooke, but they were kissing. I thought you should know." Further investigation revealed Dad had been seeing Jessica for at least 8 months, which meant their relationship had begun before Mom died. This betrayal hurt in ways I hadn't expected. Even knowing what I now knew about him, the evidence of his infidelity during Mom's illness cut deep. Then the phone calls started. Silent at first, then escalating to heavy breathing, and finally to whispered threats. The caller ID was always blocked, but I knew it was either Dad or someone he'd enlisted. When I changed my number, the calls stopped, but something worse took their place. I returned to my apartment one evening to find the door slightly ajar. Nothing valuable had been taken, not my laptop, jewelry, or cash. But every photograph of my mother had been removed from its frame and torn to pieces. Police officers took a report but wrote it off as a family dispute when I suggested my father was responsible. Without proof, they wouldn't pursue it. "Get cameras," my lawyer Rachel advised when I told her about the break-in. "Document everything. And we should consider filing for a restraining order." The restraining order hearing was my first glimpse of how effectively my father could manipulate the legal system. He arrived in court looking haggard and heartbroken, telling the judge he was just a grieving husband, worried about his daughter's increasingly paranoid behavior since her mother's death. "I only went to her workplace to check on her well-being," he said, voice breaking perfectly on cue. "And now she's trying to keep me away completely. First, she takes my wife's legacy now. She wants to erase me from her life. I've lost everything, Your Honor." The judge, a middle-aged man who kept nodding sympathetically, denied the restraining order due to insufficient evidence of threat. Outside the courtroom, when no one was watching, Dad's sorrowful expression vanished. He smirked as he passed me. "Like I said, you'll regret this," he murmured before walking away. The stress took its toll. I lost weight, couldn't sleep, and jumped at every noise. Madison, one of my few remaining friends, helped me install security cameras and stayed over frequently. She was there the night I discovered Dad had emptied the joint bank accounts he'd shared with Mom, accounts that should have been frozen pending the will dispute. "He's taken over $300,000, Rachel confirmed after speaking with the bank. "We've filed an emergency motion to freeze all remaining assets, but the damage is done." Dad wasn't just challenging the will anymore. He'd filed additional claims against Mom's business interests, alleging he'd been an unofficial partner who contributed strategic guidance throughout their marriage. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so threatening to everything Mom had built. I threw myself into gathering evidence, working with Rachel to build our case. Aunt Lisa was invaluable, sharing details about Dad's history of financial misdeeds that Mom had confided in her over the years. Together, we began to uncover a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture my father had been, systematically siphoning money from my mother's accounts for years, hiding assets and planning for a future that didn't include her. He never expected her to change the will, Aunt Lisa explained. Rebecca told me she'd discovered something that finally pushed her to act, but she didn't tell me what it was. She just said she couldn't let him control her legacy after she was gone. Whatever my mother had discovered, I was determined to find it too. With the court date approaching, Rachel and I developed our strategy. We'd need to prove Mom was mentally competent when she changed her will and counter Dad's claims of being an unofficial business partner. It meant gathering witnesses, doctors, nurses, business associates, friends who'd seen Mom during her final months. Anyone who could testify to her clear mind and intentions. We should also go through the house again, Rachel suggested. Your mother might have left evidence of your father's financial misconduct. Anything that shows his true character could be useful. I'd been avoiding Mom's home office since her death. It felt like the last place where her presence still lingered. But Rachel was right. If answers existed, they'd be there. The office was exactly as Mom had left it, organized elegant with family photos arranged on the credenza behind her desk. I started methodically going through drawers and files, scanning documents that might be relevant. In the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet behind a false panel I'd never known existed, I found a leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was my mother's distinctive handwriting entries dating back 3 years. It wasn't a traditional diary, but rather a record of her growing suspicions about Dad's financial activities. October 15, James claimed another business trip, but credit card shows charges at the Bellagio in Vegas. Called the conference he was supposedly attending, no record of his registration. Where is our money going? February 3, discovered $50,000 missing from the joint savings account. James claims it was for investment opportunity with Marcus. Called Marcus, he knows nothing about it. When confronted, James became defensive, accused me of not trusting him. Said I was too controlling with his money too. The entries continued documenting Dad's lies, unexplained expenses, and gaslighting tactics when Mom questioned him. The most recent entries were from her illness period. May 10, met with Stephanie today to update will. Can't risk leaving business shares to James C's. He'll destroy everything I've built. The gambling is worse than ever. Found evidence of loans from dangerous people. Changed the house deed and business shares to Brooke's name. She'll protect my legacy. June 18, James barely hiding his contempt anymore. Caught him in my office again. Claims he was looking for insurance papers. Found bank statements in his briefcase. He's been planning this for years. Offshore accounts. Shell companies. Need to protect assets before confronting him. Running out of time. My heart raced as I read my mother's final entry dated just 2 weeks before her death. July 30. If anything happens to me, the proof is in the garden. Under the third stepping stone, left side of path. Brooke will know what to do. I had to sit down overwhelmed by my mother's words and the confirmation of what I'd begun to suspect. She hadn't just been protecting her assets, she'd been documenting Dad's financial crimes. That night, with Madison keeping watch, I slipped into the garden with a flashlight and spade. Under the third stepping stone, on the left side of the path, wrapped in waterproof material, was a USB drive and a handwritten note, the truth about James. Tax records, hidden accounts, everything. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Be stronger than I was. Love, Mom. The USB contained meticulously organized folders, screenshots of transfers to offshore accounts, tax returns, showing discrepancies between reported income and actual deposits, photos of Dad, with known loan sharks and recordings of phone conversations where he'd discussed hiding assets. Most damning was a spreadsheet detailing years of tax fraud, income he'd hidden not just from Mom but from the IRS. I called Rachel immediately. I found evidence of Dad's tax evasion. Years of it. There was a long pause before she responded. That changes things significantly. Tax fraud is a federal crime. This isn't just about the will anymore. Over the next weeks, we prepared our case working with Mom's former business partner, Edward Kelly, who provided additional context for the financial records we'd discovered. Your mother approached me with concerns about 6 months before her diagnosis, Edward explained during our preparation session. She'd noticed discrepancies in their joint finances and suspected James was hiding something. I helped her document the irregularities, but I had no idea it went this deep. An unexpected ally emerged in Thomas Weber, Dad's former colleague who'd left their firm under mysterious circumstances years earlier. Thomas contacted me after hearing about the court case. "Your father forced me out when I questioned his accounting practices," Thomas explained. "I've been waiting for this day. I have records that corroborate what your mother found." With our case building, Rachel prepared me for what would be a grueling courtroom experience. "Your father will attack your character," she warned. "He'll bring up every mistake you've ever made, twist every good intention into something sinister. You need to be ready." We role-played potential cross-examination scenarios until I could respond calmly to even the most outrageous accusations. Still, in the nights before the court date, I had recurring nightmares about facing my father, about freezing on the stand while he smirked from across the room. The evening before court, I sat in Mom's garden, her journal open in my lap. Reading her words gave me strength. She'd faced her final months knowing the truth about the man she'd married, carrying that burden while fighting for her life. The least I could do was finish what she'd started. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Last chance to drop this. Some things are better left buried. Think about what you're about to destroy." I didn't respond. We were long past threats and manipulation. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come to light. The courthouse steps were already crowded when I arrived with Rachel and Aunt Lisa. News of the high-profile will contest had attracted local attention. I spotted Dad immediately standing with his attorney, Martin Green, a shark-like litigator known for aggressive tactics. Beside Dad stood Jessica, his much younger girlfriend, looking uncomfortable in conservative attire that couldn't quite hide her clubwear style. Dad had clearly brought her as a prop in his moving on with life narrative. Dad's performance began the moment we entered the courtroom. He nodded solemnly to acquaintances, placed a comforting hand on Jessica's arm, and dabbed at non-existent tears when the judge entered. Judge Harmon, a stern-looking man in his 60s, surveyed the courtroom before proceedings began. Martin Green opened with a masterclass in character assassination, disguised as concern. "Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about a grieving husband and father who has suffered twice, first losing his beloved wife of 35 years to a terrible illness, and now watching his only daughter, influenced by grief and possibly outside parties, attempt to dishonor her mother's true wishes." He painted a picture of Dad as the devoted spouse who had sacrificed his own career aspirations to support Mom's business ventures. According to Green, I was an ungrateful daughter who had swooped in during her mother's vulnerable final months to manipulate the will. Evidence will show that Rebecca Winters was not of sound mind when these drastic changes were made. Green continued, "We have witnesses who will testify to her confusion, her medication-induced state, and Winters' constant loving presence during her illness." Rachel remained calm, making notes without visible reaction. When her turn came, her opening statement was concise and powerful. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about honoring Rebecca Winters' wishes, her actual documented, legally expressed wishes. Mrs. Winters was a successful businesswoman who built a multi-million-dollar enterprise through her own skill and determination. 6 months before her death, with full mental capacity verified by medical professionals, she made conscious decisions about her legacy. Evidence will show that these decisions were not impulsive or influenced by medication, but rather the culmination of years of growing financial concerns about her husband's behavior. Dad's testimony came first. He portrayed himself as the heartbroken widower voice, breaking at perfectly timed intervals as he described Mom's confusion during her final months. "Rebecca wasn't herself," he testified, shaking his head sadly. "The medications affected her thinking. She would forget conversations we'd just had. Sometimes she didn't recognize our closest friends." This contradicted everything I knew about Mom's final months. Even on her worst days, her mind had remained sharp. Dad claimed he'd been Mom's unofficial business partner throughout her career, taking credit for deals I knew he'd had nothing to do with. He described how he'd nursed her day and night during her illness. A cruel lie that made my blood boil. I had been the one emptying her bedpan and administering medications while he was nowhere to be found. Green asked, "And during this difficult time, where was your daughter?" Dad sighed heavily. "Brooke visited when she could, but her life in the city kept her busy. I never blamed her for not being more present. We all cope with grief differently." I gripped the table edge so hard my knuckles turned white. Rachel placed a warning hand on my arm, reminding me to maintain composure. During the lunch break, Dad cornered me in the hallway outside the courtroom restrooms. "You look stressed, Brooke," he said with false concern. "You can still end this. Sign over the business shares, keep the house, we both move on. Dragging your mother's name through this proceeding. Is that really what she would have wanted? Don't you dare pretend to know what she would have wanted," I hissed before Rachel appeared and led me away. The afternoon brought Aunt Lisa's testimony. She spoke about Mom's clear mind and determination during her illness. "My sister knew exactly what she was doing when she updated her will," Aunt Lisa stated firmly. "She told me specifically that she was protecting her legacy for Brooke and keeping it from being squandered." Dad's lawyer tried to discredit her as the jealous sister-in-law who had always resented James's place in Rebecca's life. But Aunt Lisa remained unshaken even when Green brought up a decade-old family disagreement as evidence of her bias. Dr. Harrison's testimony was equally strong, presenting medical records that documented Mom's mental clarity. Mrs. Winters underwent regular cognitive assessments as part of her treatment protocol, he explained. At no point did she show impairment that would affect her decision-making capacity. Next came Edward Kelly and other business associates who testified to Mom's sound business judgment right up until her final days. Their accounts directly contradicted Dad's claims of being an unofficial partner. The bombshell came from financial expert Marian Torres, who meticulously outlined evidence of Dad's gambling debts and the money trail showing how he'd been siphoning funds from family accounts. Based on my analysis, Torres concluded Mr. Winters has lost approximately $1.2 million to gambling over the past 5 years, much of it coming from joint accounts with Mrs. Winters. The first day ended with Dad's attorney trying to exclude Mom's journal as evidence, claiming it was hearsay and possibly fabricated after her death. Judge Harmon reserved ruling until morning. That night, exhausted and emotionally drained, I collapsed on Madison's couch, doubting myself despite the strong day in court. "What if I'm wrong?" I whispered. "What if Mom really did want Dad to have everything and I'm just being selfish?" "That's his manipulation talking," Madison said firmly. "Your mother was crystal clear about her wishes. Don't let him make you doubt yourself now." Rachel called with reassurance. "The evidence is strong, Brooke. Tomorrow will be challenging when you take the stand, but just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." The next morning, Dad's team brought a parade of character witnesses, casual acquaintances, who claimed to have observed Mom's confusion and my absence during her illness. Most admitted under Rachel's cross-examination that they'd only visited once or twice during Mom's 18-month illness, hardly enough to assess her mental state accurately. With each testimony, I watched my father's mask slip further. The grieving widower act was giving way to something harder, colder, his true face emerging as the evidence mounted against him. Day 3 began with Dad returning to the stand for additional testimony. His demeanor had shifted subtly, more defensive, less sorrowful. Rachel had warned me this would happen as pressure mounted. Mrs. Winters told me repeatedly that she wanted me to continue running the company after she was gone. Dad insisted responding to Rachel's questions about his business expertise. She knew I was the only one who understood her vision. Rachel approached with the journal. "Your Honor, we'd like to introduce this journal kept by Rebecca Winters during the final 3 years of her life." Despite Dad's lawyer's objections, Judge Harmon allowed the journal into evidence after Dr. Harrison confirmed it was indeed Mom's handwriting. "Mr. Winters," Rachel continued, "are you familiar with this journal?" Dad's eyes narrowed slightly. "My wife kept many journals. I respected her privacy. So you never read this particular journal, never saw entries like this one from March 15th. James took another $25,000 from our joint savings. Claims it was for home repairs that never happened." Color drained from Dad's face as Rachel read selected entries documenting his financial deceptions. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. "These are the delusions of a sick woman," Dad finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. My testimony came next. Rachel guided me through recounting Mom's illness. That's the doctor appointments I'd attended. The nights spent sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed. The clear conversations we'd had about her wishes for her business and asset. Mom was absolutely lucid when she updated her will, I testified. She told me she was protecting her legacy and ensuring the business would continue operating according to her values. When Martin Green cross-examined me, he was merciless, suggesting I'd manipulated my dying mother, that I'd always been jealous of Dad's relationship with her, that I was motivated purely by greed. "Isn't it true that you've always resented your father's success?" Green demanded. "My father wasn't successful," I responded evenly. "My mother was the successful one. Dad lived off her achievements." Green's questioning grew increasingly hostile, but Rachel had prepared me well. I remained calm, answering truthfully, without rising to his provocations. The critical moment came when Green asked about my last conversations with Mom. "She told me to protect what was mine," I said. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Now I do. Green scoffed. "So your dying mother suddenly decided to cut her devoted husband out of her will and leave everything to you. That doesn't strike you as suspicious." "She didn't cut him out," I corrected. "She left him her retirement accounts and life insurance worth over $2 million. What she didn't leave him was the business she built or the home she loved. She had good reasons for that decision." When Rachel presented the financial evidence from the USB drive showing Dad's hidden accounts and tax discrepancies, the courtroom atmosphere changed palpably. Judge Harmon leaned forward, examining the documents with increased interest. Madison's testimony followed, including the recordings she'd made when Dad had unwittingly admitted his true motivations while confronting her about supporting me. "I just want what should have been mine all along." Dad's voice rang out from the courtroom speakers. "Rebecca owed me after all these years of standing in her shadow. That money is mine, and Brooke has no right to it." Dad's face contorted with rage at hearing his own words. That recording was taken out of context. He shouted, standing up. Judge Harmon called for order, but Dad continued. "This whole proceeding is a farce. Everything Rebecca built was because of me. Everything should be mine." In that moment of uncontrolled anger, the courtroom saw the real James Winters, not the grieving widower, but an entitled, rage-filled man who believed he was owed his wife's life's work. Judge Harmon called a brief recess to restore order. As Dad conferred urgently with his lawyer, Rachel turned to me. "We've got him on the ropes," she whispered. "When we reconvene, I'm going to introduce the tax evidence. Be ready." When court resumed, Dad had regained his composure, but his performance had lost its conviction. The mask had slipped too far to be convincingly repositioned. Rachel approached the stand where Dad had retaken his seat. "Mr. Winters, I'd like to ask you about these financial records found in your wife's possession." She handed him documents showing wire transfers to offshore accounts, tax returns with significant discrepancies, and the damning spreadsheet detailing systematic tax evasion. "Do you recognize these documents?" Rachel asked. Dad stared at the papers, his face pale. These could be anything. They prove nothing." "Your Honor," Rachel addressed the judge, "these records show a pattern of financial misconduct, including tax fraud dating back 7 years. Objection. Martin Green was on his feet. "These allegations are beyond the scope of this proceeding. We're here to discuss the validity of Rebecca Winters will not make unfounded accusations of criminal activity." Judge Harmon studied the documents before him. "Mr. Green, if these documents speak to Mr. Winters' character and financial relationship with the deceased, they are relevant to these proceedings." Objection overruled. Dad's composure cracked again. "This is ridiculous. My financial matters are private and have nothing to do with Rebecca's will. On the contrary, Rachel countered your wife's journal entries, make it clear that her decision to change her will was directly related to discovering these financial irregularities." Dad stood, face flushed with anger. "I demand this court give me everything that should rightfully be mine. Rebecca would never have succeeded without me. Everything she built was because of my support, my connections, my guidance." The courtroom fell silent at his outburst. In that moment of tense quiet, I spoke 2 words clearly enough for the judge to hear tax fraud. Judge Harmon's head snapped toward me, then back to the financial documents before him. His face paled as he examined the evidence more carefully. "Your Honor," I said, rising to my feet, "my mother didn't just discover that my father was gambling away their money or hiding assets from her. She found evidence of systematic tax fraud spanning 7 years. The documents on that USB drive include falsified tax returns records of unreported income and offshore accounts used to hide millions from the IRS." Dad lunged toward me, shouting incoherently, forcing the bailiff to intervene. Jessica slipped quietly out of the courtroom. Judge Harmon called an immediate recess, ordering the attorneys to his chambers. "What happens now?" I asked Rachel, as Dad was escorted to a conference room with his lawyer. "The judge will review the tax evidence," she explained. "This has evolved beyond a simple will contest. Your father could be facing criminal charges." The judge's chambers must have been tense. When Green emerged 30 minutes later, his face was grim as he headed straight to the conference room where Dad waited. Court reconvened after a 90-minute recess. The atmosphere had changed dramatically. Dad's previously confident demeanor had collapsed into a mask of barely controlled panic. Jessica was nowhere to be seen. She'd apparently decided this was a sinking ship worth abandoning. Martin Green looked distinctly uncomfortable as he approached the bench. "Your Honor, my client would like to request a brief conference with opposing counsel before proceeding," Green stated formally. Judge Harmon nodded. 15 minutes. My chambers. In the judge's private office, Green laid out a settlement offer. Dad would drop all claims to Mom's estate in exchange for the tax evidence being sealed as part of the settlement agreement. Rachel advised me to consider carefully. "If this goes further, your father will likely face criminal tax charges," she explained. "He could go to prison for years. Is that what you want?" I struggled with the decision. Part of me wanted Dad to face the full consequences of his actions. The lies, the manipulation, the years of deception. But another part remembered the father who had taught me to ride a bike and cheered at my high school graduation. "I need to talk to Aunt Lisa," I said finally. In a quiet corner of the courthouse, Aunt Lisa listened as I explained the choice before me. "What would Mom want me to do?" I asked, feeling the weight of the decision. Aunt Lisa squeezed my hand. Rebecca wasn't vindictive. She wanted protection, not revenge. But she also believed in consequences. I remembered Mom's words from my childhood after I'd lied about breaking a neighbor's window. "Doing what's right isn't always the same as doing what's easy, Brooke. Real integrity means facing consequences." Back in chambers, I gave Rachel my decision. He drops all claims to the estate, pays back the money he took from the joint accounts, and stays away from me and the business. In return, I won't actively pursue the tax issue. And if the IRS discovers the fraud independently, Judge Harmon asked. "That's not my concern," I replied. "I'm not agreeing to hide evidence if I'm legally compelled to provide it. I'm just not volunteering it right now." The settlement was drawn up. Dad's hands trembled slightly as he signed the papers formally relinquishing all claims to Mom's estate. The will would stand as written, with the house and business shares coming to me as Mom had intended. As the formal court session concluded, Judge Harmon asked to speak with me privately. "Miss Winters, I want you to know that your mother's intentions were crystal clear in these proceedings," he said. "She would be proud of how you've handled yourself." Outside the courtroom, Dad made one last attempt at manipulation. "Brooke, we're still family," he said, moving to touch my arm. "We can put this behind us. Start fresh." I stepped back, avoiding his touch. "No, Dad. We can't. You've shown me exactly who you are. I'm choosing to believe you." His face hardened. "You'll regret this. You think you can run your mother's company. You'll fail within a year, and I won't be there to help you pick up the pieces." "Goodbye, Dad," I said, simply turning away. Despite our settlement agreement, keeping the tax evidence sealed, the IRS launched an investigation into Dad's finances 2 months later. Apparently, Mom had anonymously filed a report before her death that had slowly worked its way through the bureaucratic system. The settlement prevented me from having to testify, but it didn't shield Dad from the consequences of years of tax evasion. The news of James Winters' tax troubles made the local papers. Most of our social circle finally saw the truth about the man who had played the grieving widower so convincingly. His reputation, which he'd valued above all else, was in tatters. 6 months after the court case, I stood in my mother's garden, now my garden, watching the first spring bulbs push through the soil. The home that Dad had tried to take from me had become my sanctuary. I'd repainted the walls, rearranged furniture, and made the space my own, while preserving the elements that reminded me of Mom. The garden had become my healing project. Following the notes in Mom's journal, I'd restored the flower beds she'd designed, planted her favorite roses, and spent weekends creating the sanctuary she'd always envisioned. Each flower that bloomed felt like a small victory, a reminder that beauty could grow from even the darkest soil. News about Dad filtered through occasionally. The IRS investigation had resulted in significant penalties and a repayment agreement that would take years to fulfill. He'd moved to Arizona, presumably to start over, where his reputation wasn't in ruins. He'd reached out several times, each message beginning with claims that he'd changed and deserved another chance at being a family. I maintained my boundaries without seeking revenge. His consequences weren't my responsibility, but neither was his redemption. Some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt, and perhaps shouldn't be. Many of the family friends who had believed Dad's lies reached out to apologize after the truth emerged. Some relationships were gradually repaired. Others had been irreparably damaged by their quick judgment. I learned to distinguish between those who truly cared and those who were merely curious about the drama. The most meaningful project became establishing the Rebecca Winters Foundation, using a portion of my inheritance to create scholarships for women entrepreneurs. Mom had always mentored young businesswomen, and continuing that legacy felt right. The foundation's first awards ceremony, attended by many of Mom's former colleagues and mentees, was a more fitting memorial than any gravestone could be. Therapy helped me process the complex emotions around my father's betrayal. I struggled with guilt about exposing his crimes despite knowing I'd done the right thing. My therapist helped me understand that protecting yourself isn't the same as seeking revenge, and that healthy boundaries aren't punishment, they're self-care. Your mother equipped you with everything you needed, Dr. Carter reminded me during one session. Not just material inheritance, but strength of character. That's why she trusted you with her legacy. One rainy afternoon, while organizing Mom's office, now my home office, I found an envelope I'd somehow missed during earlier cleanings. It contained a letter dated just weeks before her death, addressed to me. My dearest Brooke, if you're reading this, then you've discovered the truth about your father. I'm sorry I couldn't shield you from this pain. I stayed far too long making excuses for behavior I shouldn't have tolerated. Perhaps I was protecting my pride, or perhaps I still loved the man I thought I had married. But know this, you owe him nothing. Not your guilt, not your forgiveness, not your future. The choices he made were his alone. Remember that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. You cannot set yourself on fire to keep others warm. The garden is where I found peace when life with your father became unbearable. I hope it brings you the same solace. Plant something beautiful. Watch it grow. That's how healing works too. Slowly, with proper care, reaching toward the light. I'm so proud of the woman you've become. Strong enough to face hard truths. Brave enough to protect what matters. Kind enough to still care even when it hurts. All my love, Mom. The letter released something tight and painful in my chest. Mom had known exactly what I would need to hear. She had anticipated this journey and left breadcrumbs to guide me through. By the following summer, I hosted a garden party for the people who had stood by me. Aunt Lisa, Madison, Rachel, and a few others who had earned their place in my reconfigured life. The garden was in full bloom, vibrant with color and life. Rebecca would be so proud, Aunt Lisa said, gazing around at the transformed space. Not just of the garden, but of you. Standing up to James took incredible courage. Later, as the evening cooled and guests departed, I sat alone on the garden bench, feeling my mother's presence in the gentle breeze. The two words that had changed everything, tax fraud, had been spontaneous in the moment, but they'd been building in me since I discovered the truth. Sometimes justice comes not from elaborate plans, but from simple truths spoken at the right moment. Sometimes healing comes not from forgetting, but from facing painful realities and growing anyway. My mother had known that. In her final act of love, she'd ensured I would discover it too. The garden continued to flourish season after season, a living reminder that even after betrayal, beauty finds a way. Just like I had. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you've ever had to stand up to someone who tried to take what was rightfully yours, share your story in the comments. Your experiences might help others find their voice. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about finding strength in difficult moments. And remember, sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we finally find the courage to speak aloud.